enrich his life, but he almost ended up with a hairy Bigfoot wife. So if you go out camping, don't go where he did go, or you might just end up like old Alberto.
And one way that we think it did it, and this is kind of new science, but the idea of gigantism in animals was another strategy for competing in a threatening environment. One of the main advantages of gigantism, which occurred in the Miocene, fossils of Gigantopithecus are a good example. There were 6 species of Gigantopithecus. We think the rovers thought that there were probably 5 that were quadrupedal and 1 that was bipedal. Gigantopithecus black. And that's, if we're dealing with Gigantopithecus, then that's probably the species of it, or some descendant of that or related species that made it to North America from the Southeast Asia. So one thing that is an advantage of gigantism, and some biologists believe, anthropologists believe, and paleontologists believe, the advantage of gigantism is that it allows you to extract more energy from the food you eat. And it does that by extending the passage time of food through the digestive system. It does it by having an animal that can support a much larger diameter small intestine, a much larger large intestine with a longer span. And that allows for a slower movement of foods through the digestive system and a longer exposure to enzymes and other digestive components of the system. So, in addition to extracting more nutrients, you can produce enzymes now that take a long time to act, but can denature plant toxins. And the whole reason that gigantism probably happened in the Eocene about 45 million years ago is because after the extinction of the dinosaurs around 65 million years ago, mammals radiated over the entire planet, and they began to diversify and mutate and become these wide-ranging animal forms, both herbivore and predatory. And they were radiating very fast. Most of them were herbivores, and they were eating up all of the plants that were also mutating and evolving. So through this whole process, the survivors used natural selection to avoid being eaten. And one mechanism that they used in the Eocene was to produce plant toxins. So a lot of animals now can restrict their diet only to plants that weren't toxic. So animals, of course, react to everything in evolution. As these plants developed, animals began to develop mechanisms for dealing with plant toxins. The plants that survived that radiation in the Eocene became more and more toxic because the survivors were only the ones that had thorns, or they had chemical toxins, or some other method of repelling animals from being eaten. So, gigantism was one method of doing this. There were other methods we'll discuss, but what you're able to do with extending the passage time through the alimentary canal is extract more nutrients, denature the toxins, so that you can eat the poisonous plant that your neighbor can't eat and get energy from things that are in abundance because they're not being eaten by anybody else. That's the whole principle of gigantism. So it increases biomass available nutrients within any habitat that the animal is native to. So we think of Sasquatch as a generalist omnivore. Grizzly bears are also considered generalist omnivores. They eat a wide variety of things. Plants of all kinds, berries, roots, seeds, and animals and insects. So what we have is a list of the primary toxins that occur in plants. Many of these are what we call medicines now. They're toxic parts of plants that usually become medicines for us. But we don't eat these things generally in the food source unless we get rid of it the way we get rid of it. And we maintain dominance within our ecosystem was to denature these things by cooking. What we think Sasquatch does and other large animals out of the Eocene period that became giant 5,000, 6,000 pound animals, mammals like deers and giant rhinoceroses, which all evolved in North America, by the way, including the first primates evolved in western North America. They were changing, and what you see a lot of in that period, in the late Eocene epoch, is animals getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and we think it has to do with this phenomenon of being able to denature toxins and find food and compete in the environment, which was getting filled up with mammals of all kinds. So there's another model we can use, and that is the goat evolved about the same time as these other giant mammals. When plants were developing plant toxins, and this occurred in North America with the progenitor of the pronghorn antelope, which is native to North America. And originally pronghorn antelope was about 1.5 feet tall, and it was frugivorous. It ate fruit. But as plants developed toxins, including the fruits, berries, they developed an expansion of the esophagus, which eventually became the rumen. Ruminants are another example of dealing with toxic material, because goats and other ruminants, but especially goats, famous for this, can eat almost anything and denature the toxic parts of it, including cyanide, which we can't do. They do that by having a large rumen, which takes the food in, exposes it to enzymes and digestive juices that break down all of the edible parts, including wood, lignin, in the case of a goat, and can break down alkaloids, glycosides, phenolic resins, all of these poisonous parts of plants. It takes them 4 to 5 days to pass the food through their body. We do it less than a day. Most other animals do it less than a day. So horses are non-ruminants. They can't do any of this, and their digestion of food is very inefficient. So, most food sources we have faunal food sources. And they're the common ones you would think of. We have evidence of Sasquatch doing deer and elk, of them fishing and collecting fish, and of eating insects, turning over rocks. Tremendous bank of evidence from British Columbia all the way down to southern Colorado and New Mexico, Rockies, of Sasquatch turning over rocks, digging something out from under rocks. It's probably insects, it could be rodents, but probably beetles, ants, termites, many insects. So we come up with about 35 species, and I call them species. In this case, they're not always individual species because ants in one spot may be different from ants in the next little niche within that habitat type. But we lump them all together as one food source, as one species. There's too many different species to live. So in this sense, we have an animal eating not the same things as bears are eating. And it amounts to about 35 species of animal meat. But animals are not a consistent food source. They go away at times. After fire, you lose all the insects, and they migrate somewhere else where they die off. And they come back slowly as revegetation occurs. So everything is really based on the plants. The plants are the indicators of the habitat that allows the animals to live. Plants are usually there all the time. If you have a fire, most of the roots stay intact, and revegetation occurs fairly quickly after the fire. So we identify habitat types, even though they involve animals that live there, by the vegetation that happens to be there. And that's the key to understanding these migratory patterns of any large omnivore, including Native Americans when they were living in these habitats in the wild. So we have about 84 primary floral food sources. These are the preferred species that almost all of the animals living in the wild will eat because they don't contain very many toxins, if any at all. So the primary floral food sources are the base upon which you can look at an omnivore's food source. About 94 species. And they include things like sedges, which have no toxins, but have a lot of very usable carbohydrate value for energy and to convert into fat for wintering over. Pine nuts are the primary protein source for grizzly bears. We think of grizzlies as primarily meat eaters. Well, that's not true. They're primarily vegetarian. And they primarily eat pine nuts in the Yellowstone ecosystem and the northern Rockies for their protein source. You may have read that grizzlies are now changing their food habits because the extreme droughts and warming at high elevations are causing these foods to disappear. They're getting infected with pine bark beetles that were never there before, but because of the warming climate, the pine bark beetles don't freeze out in the winter and they're able to invade these pristine high elevations above 10,000 feet, or above 10,000 feet where white bark pine lives. So grizzlies are now converting their primary protein source from vegetation, pine nuts, to moths, because moths are very abundant in the alpine, and grizzlies prefer the alpine climate over the lowland climate that black bears prefer. So we're having a major shift in grizzly bear food protein sources right now, and just in the last 10 years. There are mechanisms for getting protein more efficiently. We should mention this because it's important to know that the bears don't have to climb up into the trees and break open each individual cone and eat a seed, one seed at a time. Pine nuts are stored by other animals like squirrels. Red squirrel is a prodigious collector of pine nuts. They store them underground, and grizzlies have this very sensitive nose, thousands of times more sensitive than our sense of smell, and they can detect where the pine nuts are under the ground and dig them up. This is a dug-up squirrel cat where grizzlies feed every year for white bark pine nuts. It's not too far-fetched to assume, since I've done it and Native Americans did it, that Sasquatch can also dig up squirrel catches and come up with gallons of pine nuts within 10 minutes. So if you wonder why these large animals, or how these large animals can survive in an environment where we don't see much going on food-wise, there are concentrated sources of protein, carbohydrates, and fats in the environment if you know how to get it. And we can assume that this omnivore probably knows some of these methods because our models know how to do this. There's just an abundance of berries. These are thinly huckleberries that occur above 9,000 feet in the mountains. It's very abundant along water sources. We find most of the very abundant food sources occur close to rivers and streams in the high mountains, and that's where most of the sightings of Sasquatch occur. So, pond release have edible roots, very high in carbohydrates. And then we have a list of secondary floral food sources. We've got 82 of these, and they are toxic to many animals, including humans, and we don't cook it. We think of a lot of foods as being edible that really aren't if we don't cook them, like potatoes are toxic to humans because of solanine, which is an alkaloid that kill it. But if you boil it, it's like, it's all in the skin, so you cut off the skin, you eat it. But most of the nutrients are in the skin. So one way we get a lot of extra nutrients is by boiling. And we think that animals like Sasquatch, with the gigantism phenomenon affecting their digestion, they're able to detoxify selanin and most of the other toxic components. Lichens are another thing we think that Sasquatch can probably eat. Many lichens are very, very toxic, but they can be denatured by goats with prolonged passage time through the rumen. So it's reasonable to assume that Sasquatch can eat lichens and many of the other poisonous plants. The organic acids, mostly the poisonous in those. Things like buffalo berries have a high saponin content. We don't eat them. It's interesting, though, that Europeans don't eat buffalo berries. This russet buffalo berry, they eat silver buffalo berry, but the russet one tastes horrible to us. It's just offensive. Grizzly bears can eat it. They have a mechanism for detoxifying saponin. And Native Americans ate it. They used to call it, when the white man came, they called it Indian ice cream. It's interesting. Native Americans can eat this berry, and Europeans can't. So there is some adaptive evolution going on here. So we combine the primary and secondary food sources, you get 176 species in the Northern Rockies. This almost doubles the number of species that can be eaten if you don't have this mechanism of gigantism working together. So what does this all mean? Now we have almost doubled the ability to eat food, double the abundance of the food source within the same habitat that humans are running out in bears. It means that you can support a very large animal, an animal with a lot of body weight. But there are other factors to consider with gigantism, and one of them is the size of the head, the occlusal surface of the cheek. And if you caught Jeff Nolan's talk yesterday, you saw that huge mandible that causes the neck to not appear when you film a frontal appearance, and that mandible is controlled by a huge masticatory muscle system that can crush very, very tough and fibrous roots and nuts. So although you have the pine nut as a food source in the right season when they're available, theoretically you can obtain a lot of nutrition from the roots of trees and shrubs if you are able to crush them. And this is what the primatologists call durophagia. Durophagia is the ability to crush and break down very tough, sinuous fibers, woody materials, and extract nutrients from them. So although the pine tree produces nuts, it can also be pulled out of the ground when they're young, and the roots are eaten for another carbohydrate food source. So this adds even more. It's kind of hard to calculate those things. But being able to dig in the ground and extract nutrients from other animal stored food, and being able to break down woody fibrous materials to extract nutrients is going to add to this 86% increase in the food source in a given habitat forest systems. And it's hard to calculate that. Bears, of course, are equipped to dig out these things, but they don't have the same durophagia that Sasquatch will have with breaking down roots and underground storage organisms. So that all added up together is well over 220 species that are available. Some are counted more than once because you eat the fruits and the nuts off of the species, and then later in the year you eat the roots, the storage organs, they call them. for carbohydrate sources. This may allow for things like going into dormant state during winter, even hibernation, ecological hibernation is kind of there too. So this just shows the difference, the final count on the species available of forest habitats in the northern Rockies is more than double what would be available to animals that don't have this ability, this mechanism to digest inedible foods. And that all ends up to reclusive, which is one of the characteristics we associate with Sasquatch. How can they be up there in families weighing 800 to 1,000 pounds and hardly ever be seen? Well, grizzly bears are seen a lot in Yellowstone because they have to go to Lamar Valley, they have to go to those meadows next to the roads, and they have to be eating constantly to find enough food. They have a very inefficient digestive system. And they don't do well with toxics in plants, so they have to avoid most of the plants in the Yellowstone ecosystem because they simply can't digest them and they taste bitter. So, we have an animal that can be reclusive because of its digestive system. It does not have to expose itself to the threat of predators like us. We're probably on his list of primary enemies. So, just kind of summarize, you need several things for a good habitat. You need this water, primary thing. That's why it's the water animal. Occurs around streams, rivers. Just watch the Patterson-Gimlin film. There's a river right there. Most of the tracking we do in the northern Rockies is following streams or going from one stream to another. Not because the fish necessarily, although that's on the list. There's just an abundance of food that occurs in the riparian zone along the stream. And we need food, and you need escape cover. That's what currently needs escape cover, just as many other animals do. Mountain goats call escape terrain rocky, open, windy mountainsides where they can escape things like mountain lions and wolves. But in the case of an animal like Sasquatch, it's a forest dweller, thick forest with lots of vegetation and undergrowth, or probably prime habitat. And of course, wherever we have Sasquatch sightings, we have lots of water. So what we do with the North American Meat Project is we collect the data, we define the habitats, we look for tracks, the grizzly track. We find grizzly tracks very commonly where there are Sasquatch tracks. And we catalog all of that and overlap to see what are the common factors that lead to these tracks occurring at certain habitat types at certain times of the year. And it fits. If this didn't work, it wouldn't fit year after year, but we're finding that it all makes sense. If it were a hoax, this wouldn't happen. It's not a hoax. It's not misidentification, because that's Jeff Milgram's job. We both interview people, but we see a lot of funny tracks. We see tracks that aren't really Sasquatch tracks. They're usually bear tracks or some other tracks. Now people wear those finger shoes, and some of those are being interpreted and turned into us as Sasquatch tracks. But Jeff and Robert Grant have done an excellent job of defining the proportions to real Sasquatch tracks and to define the dynamics of those tracks. So if they don't bend in the right place over certain types of terrain, we know they're not real. So combining actual definable tracks with habitat types is leading us to predictability. We're able to look at places and say, next week we're going to have some Sasquatch activity in this area. We can't say 100%, but we can say in this area we know the limitations of the habitat with certain key factors that add up to required nutrition, and you can make it like an 80% prediction you're going to have people reporting tracks in that area at that time. And you find other anomalous things that are only common where you find Sasquatch activity, and we document all of that because those are key important indicators that we have actual activity. tracks are a pretty good indicator. But when you find large animals like elk who were died by having their necks broken, and they always break between the first and second cervical vertebrae, that is what we are calling a Sasquatch indicator, because grizzlies can't do that. They cannot take the head and bend it back over the spine and break the vertebrae in that way and cause death. We find that in elk and in deer, where there have been recent sightings, and in one case a horse that was killed that way in Colorado. So this is a unique indicator that we use. And part of the way we get this information, we don't have to go on television, it's not very often, is we contact the agencies that manage the land where these Sasquatch activities occur. The U.S. Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, Natural Resources Conservation Service. We've presented at the Wildlife Society. We lectured at university anthropology departments all over the West. Jeff is good at publishing in professional journals, so that information is available. We publish things together for the scientific community to digest. If they take the time to read it, they will find out this is genuine science. We talk to a lot of tribal members because we believe that that's really where most of the information resides in the history of these animals. And I call them animals in the same sense that I can refer to Native Americans who have it in an animal way. If these are beings, they may be more human than ape, we don't know, but they follow the patterns of wildlife distribution based on food habits. We talked to ranchers who have given us a tremendous amount of information, even though they didn't tell their neighbors about it. They usually only told their spouse who got laughed at. And then are available enough through some of these agencies that they work with, that they will talk to us about it and give us reports. There's a lot of them out there. They're coming from these kinds of people. We're getting reports from professionals who work in the backcountry. They never tell anybody about it. You won't see any of these people in the newspapers. But when they find out that the university has a group called the North American Aid Project, they'll give us a phone call and confidentially tell us the story. And then we can follow up with it. So we've had backcountry rangers, Park Service rangers, wildlife biologists, range conservation has just given us a lot of good time. Certainly don't tell anyone else. They're afraid they'll get the same treatment I got when I started in investigation and having my job threatened if I ever spoke about it again. Which is why I do not work with the Game Fish Department today. Which is the best decision I ever made because consultants do whatever they want to do. Not tied down to a company policy. We have a lot of forestry technicians that are timber beasts, we call them, who go out and mark timber. And they're out there all the time. They have had a lot of really good sightings for us. Trail crews, road crews, wilderness guides, people working for companies, outfitting companies, have seen a lot of these things. So the next phase is to follow up. We've been working with several different things. Trying to lure them in with music is something I mentioned last night. We do that on a regular basis, and it's working. We are experimenting with very high quality, highly trained trailing dogs that are used as cadaver dogs are one type you've heard of where they look for dead people, but there are also dogs that are trained to look for missing people while they're still alive. Entirely different sense of looking for them. But we experimented with taking Sasquatch samples that we have of hair and scat, and there are a lot of hair samples out there. That Jeff has a lot of them. In his lab, we also have some very suspiciously reliable scat samples that we're using. And these dogs identify them as something they've never run into before. There is a sign they give their handlers that tells us that this is something new and different. If it looks like it came from Sasquatch, for instance, we followed a track line once that the Forest Service had clued me into, and I went out there and followed the track line for a long ways. And at one point, the tracks, which were one right in front of the other over very rough terrain, coming out of the wilderness, stopped. They separated, so the right foot was right across from the left foot, and then all the weight was put onto the balls of the feet, what we would call the balls of the feet, the heads of the metatarsals. This animal was obviously squatting, and right in the appropriate place was this scat that showed extremely meticulous digestion of plant material, even though it looked like a dog scat. So this was an animal that could digest, very carefully digest, all of the nutrients in sedges and grasses. It couldn't be a dog. And we use a scat in this case like that. We think that's a high reliability of the Sasquatch scat. And try to train them to that extent. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of money. These people are professional in what they do. They don't do it for free. They do most of their work for free. But we're going to send them off on this thing to raise and train a dog or a team of dogs to follow a specific scent. They really can't be used for anything else. So it's an expensive proposition. But anyway, we've experimented with this, and perhaps we can come up with a body nutrition rate should be about the same as it is for humans. If you have a population of 20 animals in a mountain range, some of them are going to be reaching old age, and over several thousand years living in that mountain range, you can expect a mortality rate and body parts laying around in the mountains that can be found in those home ranges. So that's what we're going to get for DNA and possibly bone. So that's it.
That is outstanding, and I think you just had the Sasquatch equivalent of TMI. Too much good information. That's wow. And I think I have a new term for the man cave. It's called escape cover. So, all right, we're going to do some door prizes.